you guys. Welcome back to another episode of Bellies, Babies, and Birth, the podcast where we talk about all things related to really female pelvic health. It's not just pregnancy related. And my favorite thing, as you've come to know by now, is connecting with other providers and birth workers in the Valley and just bringing that information to you guys, helping you know more about resources that are available to you, services, understanding more about your health. And really excited today to have Diane Palacios on. I just messed it up after clarifying it with you. Palacios.
Palacios.
Palacios. With us today, and she is a counselor, and there's lots of different types of therapists and counselors. So I'm going to let her share more about that. But really excited to bring this to you. We've actually been talking a lot about mental health in our weekly wellness emails that go out this month, and next month talking a lot about gut health and nutrition. So just really excited to discuss this very important topic with you, not just related to postpartum mental health, but just different types of trauma and services that are out there. So Diane, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. And would you please share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you. So my name is Diane Palacios. I am a licensed professional counselor and a licensed independent substance abuse counselor, as well as I'm certified in perinatal mental health and EMDR. And so I'm actually a consultant in training as well for EMDR. And so what that means is, first of all, perinatal mental health is around the perinatal period. So that can mean anything from preconception, trying to conceive. It can mean during pregnancy or medically after a year postpartum. However, sometimes we will see that birthing people do not get treatment during the postpartum period. And so the postpartum depression or anxiety can extend beyond that first year. And then EMDR, it is a trauma therapy, and it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so what EMDR does is it helps to create new neural pathways in the brain for healing. And so it connects our negative beliefs along with what we notice in our body, and as well as our emotions. And so I don't know if you've ever heard that there's this book, The Body Keeps Score. Yes, you've heard about
Very
that
familiar.
book.
Yes, we've read it.
Yeah. And so trauma stays in our body. And so a lot of times we will experience something mentally like, okay, I'm just going to power through. I'm going to get through it. I'll move on. But our bodies continue to react. And so we've had these reactions of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And so trauma gets trapped in the body. And so I can talk a little bit more. I'll talk a lot more about that in a little bit. But that's a little bit about me. I've been a therapist for, like over a decade, but I can't count. So counting's not my strength. And then I also serve on the board of Postpartum Support International, or Postpartum Support Arizona chapter. And so wanting to not only provide the therapy one-on-one to folks, but also being able to have a more macro level influence and help the community as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think we met partly through PSI, but also obviously the Birth Expo, which is my favorite event every year. What sort of triggered your interest or passion for mental health, specifically related to pregnancy and postpartum?
Yeah, so I'm a mother of three. My oldest just turned 11. So I have an 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And so we had three children within 3.25 years of each other. And so part of my story and my journey also stemmed out of wanting to be able to provide space for moms who are struggling. Because I think a lot of times, and especially even over a decade ago, when I was having my children, that postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety wasn't talked about. And it was just kind of, you see things on Facebook or you see people and you just kind of power through. You're just like, I just have to make it through. I don't have an option. And so not really realizing, oh, I'm actually struggling and need help. And so just normalizing how hard parenting is at every different stage. But especially during those first formative years, it's hard. You're going through almost an identity crisis and a shift of who am I and who is this little baby, learning each other. Who is this baby? Who am I? How do I, get to know them? It's hard. Those are hard years for a lot of people.
Yeah, let's pause there for a second because obviously in our space, we specialize in pelvic health and we work with a lot of pregnancy and postpartum. And us therapists, when we meet as a team to discuss their plan of care, or even with massage and acupuncture as part of our team, where they're at and how things are going for them, we definitely try to include that mental health piece. And we definitely big believers in body keeps a score, and all the stuff that he talks about with myofascial work and yoga are absolutely the foundation of why I built this space the way I did and have the yoga studio as well. And let's stay on that postpartum period, that initial like 12 weeks, like you said, it's an identity crisis. There's so much change. And even in the best of circumstances, right? You've got a loving partnership. The baby was wanted and planned for, no significant financial stress, have family support, like truly best case scenario. That does not necessarily negate postpartum struggles and mental health struggles. But let's say whatever a situation a postpartum mom is in, because we talk a lot about how the new moms aren't really even fully in their bodies. And a lot of times their goals and their healing journey look a lot different than some of our other clients who come and sort of embrace the trauma work or some of the deeper healing. And so what I'd love for you to share is, what are some things that new moms can do? We're going to go a couple avenues, but right now, what are some things that new moms can do to just check in with themselves, just to regain any kind of sense of self from like your area of expertise? Like, do you have any tips or wisdom to share with that?
Yeah, yeah. So one thing that I like to talk about, but also navigate very gently, is what does self-care look like now? Because having a baby, it's hard to get that self-care. You're not sleeping as much, maybe if you're nursing, you're having night nursings, going to the bathroom, especially if you're home alone or you're on maternity leave, and your partner's gone back to work, that can be really hard. How do I take a shower with, this baby here? How do I brush my teeth? How do I do anything without putting the baby down? And so really figuring out and it's so individualized, right? It's going to look very individual for each mama, for each birthing person, of what their self-care would look like. So for me, for example, I knew that I needed a shower every day to feel okay, to feel human. So I would get up super early and I would pump, because I'd always pump first thing in the morning because I went back to work after my 12 weeks. And so I wanted to make sure I had my stash. So I'd pump first thing in the morning. And so whatever would happen with the baby in the morning, my husband would deal with that while I was showering and pumping, because once I know he was gone at work, it was just all me. So I had to take care of myself, even if it was getting up at 4:30 in the morning. For some people, that's not going to be self-care. That's going to be self-torture because they would rather get the sleep. And so it's really knowing yourself and what you need personally. And so for maybe somebody, I would rather sleep, and then maybe I take my shower at night and hand off the baby. However, some people don't have partners. And so you can't hand off the baby, and you really do feel alone. So finding another huge thing is finding in those first few weeks is support. Who is your village? Who is your community? If you don't have organic community, there are a lot of support groups out there. And something that I see so much all of the time with my mamas is how lonely they feel. It's hard being a mom. It's
Same.
hard being a working mom. It's hard being a stay-at-home mom. It is lonely, especially in those moments where you're up at like 2 a.m. with a sick kid who's crying, when you're just in the middle of like, my baby's crying and they don't have language and I can't figure out what it is. I fed them, I've nursed them, I've burped them, I've done, and I just can't figure it out. And there are times where it just feels so lonely. So having somebody, at least one person that you can call or text and just be like, this is really hard. And I think being honest with yourself. I remember there's times where like realizing my life has changed forever. I can't even go to the store now without planning around my boobs, without planning around my baby. And that's huge. Um, you know, I think being able to, my life, I can't just get up and go and do what I want, or even go to the bathroom when I want because I'm nursing, or, there's times I would take the baby in the bathroom with me because that's was my option. I'd either have a screaming baby or I'd have to go to the bathroom with a baby on me. And so it's sometimes what I chose. So I think figuring out what is it, if it's one thing you can do to take care of yourself, what is that thing? Whether if it's sleep, whether if it's hygiene, um, whether if it's enlisting in community support, having some people supportive. And with that is what's tricky is, and I tell families this all the time, is you do what works for you. Everybody has advice for you. Everybody has an opinion, and it's about what works for your family. You do what works for your family, because what worked for somebody else may not work for you. So finding and figuring out your own rhythms and what's really gonna to work.
Awesome. Those are really great tips. And don't worry, you guys, if you're listening and going, wait, what'd she say? We're going to include these notes and tips in the show notes. So don't stress. And maybe we even collaborate and create some sort of postpartum self-questionnaire of some sort. I'm sure there's things out there, but anyway, my brain is going to spin on that later. Another thing I think is important for us to talk about is mental health's getting a lot more press these days. It's getting discussed a lot more, but I still think there's such a massive amount of confusion and stigma around postpartum mental health. And we talk about baby blues, postpartum depression, postpartum rage, postpartum psychosis, and there's a
Yes.
scale along
Yes.
that I don't think we know a lot about. And I know we can't, like, it doesn't really serve anybody to label or pigeonhole into a category, but just what can you share about that spectrum and the self-awareness that could really serve a mom or her tribe? Because a lot of times the moms are so glazed over, lost, we don't even know, sleep deprived. I remember my
Right.
mom and my husband telling me, Pump, you're going to sleep. I went and slept a night at my mom's because I just was like not functioning very well. And I didn't really even know it.
Right.
Thankfully,
Right.
nothing that ended up dangerous, but you know, they saw
Right.
in me that I wasn't myself. And so I
Right.
think, what can you share about that spectrum? And I mean, it's sometimes medicine's critical to get some help. And other times it's like, well, it's really just about some support and some sleep and some nutrition.
Right, right.
Help
So
us fill
yeah,
in the blanks.
absolutely. Yeah, so it's PMADS, so perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And so they fall in mood disorders, they fall in categories of anxiety disorders. Sometimes what we find is people do not have a diagnosis until postpartum, that they don't realize that they are struggling with anxiety or a mood disorder. And so what let's you talked about baby blues, so we'll talk about that. That's within the first 2 weeks of having a baby. And so that can look like being extra tearful, crying. Your hormones have just come out of your body, and now your body's just trying to regulate itself again. And so you're having this huge shift of hormones. And if you're nursing, or if you are not nursing and then your milk is drying up, like there's so much going on within those first 2 weeks. So your body is just out of whack. You're in a fog. Depending if you've had C-section, if you had a vaginal birth, if you've torn, if you've had birth trauma, if you have a baby in the NICU, I mean, we could go on and on about this. And so your body is still healing. I remember, when I had my first baby, is I did all 3 home births. And then I had some issues with me where I had to go into a hospital just to get like checked, and I was fine, everything was good. But then I realized, like, coming home, like, wait, I didn't learn how to feed my baby, and I was in a fog, and I didn't even like realize my baby wasn't nursing. And so I ended up having to have support with lactation consultant, and that's a big cause also of mental health issues with a lot of women, is wanting to breastfeed or nurse and not being able to, or struggling to nurse, or having this dream of, oh, I'm going to bond with my baby and nurse, and we're going to just sit here and lay down and relax with each other. And they found that nursing is hard, getting thrush, getting just the latch, all of those things. So going back, so baby blues within those first 2 weeks. If someone's noticing that they're if they're crying, they're feeling down, maybe even having some suicidal thoughts, having feelings of, I don't want my baby, like I've wanted this so bad, this has been my dream, but I don't want my baby, I don't want this life. If it's past 2 weeks, you're going to start looking into postpartum depression. Just feelings of maybe isolating more, not being able to get up. Maybe it's lack of caring for yourself. You stop doing your hair, you stop brushing your teeth, you stop showering. You're basically keeping the baby alive, and that's about it. And so again, like it's hard to multitask when you're having a baby. There's a lot to do, like, dishes, laundry, you go through so much more laundry when you have a baby. But if it's hard to do all of those tasks, that's normal. But if you're just like, I can't do it, and I can't even like recognize that it needs to be done, like that's when you're going to want to start looking at depression more. And then with anxiety, that may look like feeling like I'm so exhausted, my body's exhausted, but my mind is racing. I'm laying my head down on my pillow at night and I'm thinking, I need to do the dishes. I need to change my baby. Is my baby breathing? I need to check on the baby. Okay, they're breathing. I need to wash the baby's clothes. I need to call the pediatrician. I need to do that. And your brain just can't turn off. And so that's anxiety. Also, hearing phantom cries can be a part of anxiety, where you feel like you're hearing their baby cry, but they're not. And your brain is just so kind of like revved up that you can't turn it off. You're excessive worry, like it's a light switch. You just can't turn that worry light switch off. It's just going and going and going and going. It could look like just feeling so out of control that I need to control everything that happens with this baby, whether it be how I organize their clothes, their diapers. So it may show up in having to organize or having to have things in the house a certain way, or allowing certain people to be able to hold the baby or not hold the baby. And so that will show up as postpartum anxiety. And so we also have postpartum OCD, which I really want to talk about and differentiate that between postpartum psychosis, because a lot of people get postpartum OCD and postpartum psychosis mixed up, and they're very distinct. So postpartum OCD may look like intrusive thoughts coming in, and it may be intrusive images. And mom is horrified that she's having these bizarre thoughts. It may look like smothering the baby. It may look like, I'm going to throw my baby down the stairs. I'm going to throw the baby in the pool and drown them. I'm going to put my baby in the oven. And mom is having these intrusive thoughts and these intrusive images, and she's absolutely horrified and terrified and afraid to tell anybody because she doesn't want her baby taken away.
Right.
And so she doesn't get help or doesn't say, I'm having this happen. And a lot of times moms have told me, I have postpartum psychosis. And I said, okay, tell me what's going on. And they tell me, and I was like, mama, that's not psychosis, that's OCD.
Yeah,
And
I've
so,
never heard this. Almost, I would have thought what you were describing towards the end of your PP postpartum anxiety description about trying to control everything to calm your brain, that to me sounded like OCD. I've never heard this description. Please keep going.
Yes. And so the difference with postpartum, and so with postpartum OCD, absolutely get help, get therapy, even potentially medication. And so I would recommend medication just to kind of be able to, again, like work with therapy and having those hormone levels or those chemical levels to become balanced. And maybe it's not, medication isn't forever, but it's for a season. And so postpartum psychosis, these are the mamas we see on the news that have killed their babies. And so how postpartum psychosis shows up is people sometimes have a predisposition. Maybe they've been diagnosed previously or undiagnosed with bipolar, with schizophrenia. Not everybody that has bipolar and schizophrenia is going to have postpartum psychosis, but there is a higher, the statistics are higher. So 1 or 2 of every births out of 1,000 have postpartum psychosis. So the statistics are very low. 1 to 2 out of 1,000. And so what that looks like is delusions. irrational thoughts, mania, where they're not sleeping for 23 hours, delusions, and sometimes they're spiritual in nature and saying, and the mom is saying, oh, I have to kill my baby or I have to kill myself to keep us safe. And so they actually think that harming their baby will keep their baby safe. And if somebody has postpartum psychosis, they need immediate hospitalization. This isn't something that can wait. They need immediate hospitalization. And so potentially even being petitioned if they are not willingly going to go willingly. With postpartum OCD, hospitalization most of the time is not necessary. And the difference is here, I want to just make sure that you understand the difference, is that postpartum OCD, the mom feels shame, they feel remorse, they feel awful about these thoughts. Postpartum psychosis, they think they have to do this. They don't see that it's a wrong thought, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like that they're not with postpartum psychosis. There's that delusional piece. There's a little bit of a break from reality.
Psychotic break. Yes,
Yeah.
there's a
Whereas
psychotic
with the
break.
OCD, they know that those thoughts aren't right.
Right.
Interesting. I'm so glad you've made this distinction.
Yes. And with
well, I want to tease out something you said. So definitely not everybody who's bipolar or has schizophrenia or dissociative disorders of some sort are going to have this when they have a baby.
Correct.
However, if you have previous postpartum depression, or not postpartum, if you have previous issues with depression, anxiety, some sort of mental health diagnosis, it is more likely that you'll struggle postpartum, right?
Yes. Yes. And so for when pregnant mamas come to me and they already have depression or anxiety, we're just monitoring and checking in frequently to make sure that they're okay after they have their baby in several months afterwards. And so because they can have this up until a year, maybe the first 3 months they don't have any symptoms, but then it comes on after 3 months, or shifts change, or we have that 4-month sleep regression, and then it's like, well, I thought I had everything going how I expected, and now there's these changes. And then every time the baby has brain development or hits a wonder week, there's brain movement, so the baby becomes more active, and sleep may be regressed. And so when baby isn't sleeping, that usually means mom isn't sleeping as well. One more disorder that I want to talk about is postpartum post-traumatic stress disorder, because this one is huge as well. So a lot of times people that have experienced previous trauma, this comes up, especially if they've had a history of sexual abuse, because when delivering a baby, through the birth canal, that they may experience some sensations. Not everybody, again, but just to be aware. And I'm not trying to scare anybody, but just to be kind of aware that that may come up. Or postpartum post-traumatic stress disorder can be any type of birth trauma. It can be even, I planned a vaginal birth and I ended up with cesarean. Or I planned a home birth and it ended up in the hospital, or I planned a birth center and it ended up not how I wanted. So it didn't meet my expectation. And so I do a lot of birth trauma. That's kind of what what I specialize in, is birth trauma. Also grief. I see mamas for grief, for miscarriage, for stillbirth, infant mortality. And so I do EMDR with mothers with that, with postpartum anxiety. There's some old rumors about not doing EMDR with pregnant or postpartum women. And so I just want to break those rumors.
Before we dive into EMDR, because I'm very excited to get there. But before we dive into that, I want to also ask you, women that have had previous miscarriages or possibly even chosen abortion for whatever reason prior, don't you sometimes see with them also some postpartum PTSD? Like now that, we're working with a mama. So especially the sexual trauma, that's part of why we try to do pelvic manual therapy before they deliver, so that doesn't trigger, and we can go through it really slowly and everything and help prepare them as best you can. But also, we're dealing with a mama who had a miscarriage. She's pregnant again. She's excited, but she's scared of miscarrying again.
I'm
And she's
terrified.
also feeling some funky guilt about being happy and guilt about having lost it. Like there's just so
Right.
many big feelings happening.
Right, right. And you can hold joy in one hand and grief in the other. And it feels, how can I hold both of these things in my hands? It feels like I should only have one or the other. And something again with EMDR or, in therapy, I do is parts work. Like there might be a part of you that is still sad and grieving, and that's okay. But there's a part of you also that experiences joy. And so you can allow these different parts to come up in your life, and one part doesn't have to dominate over the other. You can hold multiple things at the same time.
Yeah, that's so huge and valid. And I'm
Mhm.
glad that ended up coming up. All right,
Yeah.
let's dive into EMDR because a big part of Body Keeps the Score and a big part of why I want to connect with you. And we have other EMDR therapists and somato experiencing. And I want to keep it general and then we'll dive specifically into EMDR. We often, when there's trauma, I do not refer to talk therapists or those kinds of counselors because again, it's held in the body, it's held in the subconscious, and it's not on the conscious level to discuss or process verbally.
Right.
So I feel like EMDR is one of the most amazing ways, but there's also different ways to get to those subconscious pieces and help people. You can correct my language, but like we talk about like just to integrate and to not have all these disjointed, disconnected pieces, but to be
Mhm.
able to reintegrate whatever that looks
Yes.
like, whether it's on that emotional level or the
Mhm.
physical level or the
Mhm.
subconscious, like whatever's going on. So yeah, tell us specifically how EMDR does that so brilliantly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what you were just mentioning is parts work, is talking about all those different parts of yourself. And so sometimes there's parts of us that are feeling one way about something, or our brain um, is telling us something, or just trying to get through, or rationalizing, no, I'm okay, everything's fine, but your body, you feel something different in your gut.
Right.
So what EMDR does, it's the adaptive information processing um, model. And so what EMDR does is, how I like to explain it a little bit is, it's kind of like a computer, right? And so we have these experiences that happen. And when we experience trauma, we go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. And so fawn is more of, I'll explain that. I think fight, flight, and freeze people understand. But fawn is when you are more codependent and you're more like protecting. Like, for example, maybe a victim of domestic violence like just got hit, and then she will be like, oh, it was my fault, I shouldn't have spilled the water on the floor. And so that's called fawning. And so that's also a, a trauma response. And so we have these different trauma responses that live in us. And when we talk about trauma, there's a big T and there's a little t. So a big T would be something like birth trauma, a car accident, sexual abuse, physical abuse. A little t might be something like you're at work and your boss asks you to answer a question and you weren't prepared to answer the question and you just kind of freeze for a minute. Or somebody calls you out and you're like, whoa, I wasn't ready to respond to that. And so that's called a little t, whereas it's not an extreme trauma, but your body still isn't prepared. So trauma I define as something that your body is not prepared to handle. It can be at a larger scale or a smaller scale. And so what EMDR does is, it stands for eye movement. And so the founder of EMDR, her name is Francine Shapiro. She found that she was thinking of disturbing memories or disturbing thoughts, and she was walking through the park. And so as she was walking through the park, she was using bilateral stimulation, and she noticed her eyes were moving. And so with that bilateral stimulation, that's something I'll talk a lot about today, is that she noticed her memories became less disturbing. And so what we do with EMDR is we use eye movements, and that can be done in a lot of different ways. So and it can be done in telehealth or in person. So I use buzzies in person if people want. Sometimes I'll use my hands. Sometimes with mamas, if they're holding their baby, I'll have them stand up and sway back and forth. Or if it's telehealth, I have a little dot that goes across the screen tapping So any way we can get that bilateral stimulation, and and it's so different for everybody. Some people aren't comfortable using buzzies. Some people aren't comfortable with the ball. Some people, so it's just finding really what works for that individual person, because again, treatment is so individualized for the person. And so the reason I'm talking about the eye movements, because it helps to reconnect those neurotransmitters in the brain. And so when we have downloaded information in our brain, we've downloaded trauma, it's like it's almost frozen. And so what it does is when we do that bilateral stimulation, it goes through and it kind of like sweeps away, or like gets rid of that virus, right? And then it re-downloads information into a way that that is like new and fresh, and we see it in a different way. And so it's basically getting rid of a negative belief that we hold. It's over, most of the time it's over responsibility, safety, or power. Those are kind of the three themes that are hit or that are touched. And so in EMDR, we come up with, what is the negative belief? What is the negative belief that you hold about yourself? And so sometimes I have to dig a lot to really get what that negative belief is, because it will be like, well, people don't like me. Okay, so what does that say about somebody, who people don't like them? Because it needs to be an I statement. And then I have them come up with a positive belief. We rate it on different scales. How believable is the positive belief? How believable is the negative belief? And so we come up with a scenario. So when are times in your life where you have experienced this negative belief? That's called a float back. We float back in life of like, what are the past? So we target what's happening in the past where you've experienced this negative belief. What are your current triggers, or what's happening presently where this negative belief is showing up? And then what are your future desires? What do you want for yourself moving forward? And so we kind of we formulate a plan of like, let's target these things in the past. Let's target what's happening currently, and then let's work on future. Or even I've had somebody that I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but a future template, or they had an anniversary of the death of their baby coming up. And so we processed that, even though it wasn't, it was a past event, but that anniversary date was coming up, and she's like, I don't know how I'm going to survive this day. And so I said, okay, let's process it. So when we process, sometimes people like to go with smaller memories first, or some people just like to target those larger memories. I really go by what the client says, of like what they're comfortable with. Like, do you want to go with, your touchstone memory or your worst memory, or do we want to go smaller? So some people prefer smaller to build up. And then some people prefer to just hit right away. So I go with what they are comfortable with. But before I start processing, we do a lot of resourcing. I talk about parts work with them. We talk about, I do a calm space, I do container, I do a disassociation scale as well, because sometimes when we go through trauma, we disassociate. And so I want to know, at what level is this person disassociating? And then through bilateral stimulation, they're able to process through their negative experience and actually hold on to a truth. And so I tell people, this is your truth now. This is your truth, and living out your truth. And so when they start living out their truth, they show up in such a different way. And it is such a beautiful process to watch. It is so beautiful to watch somebody who's in so much pain, or who's been through so much, actually believe, and like wholeheartedly believe, not just with their head, but we do a body scan. We clear the body, make sure it's cleared through the body, and emotionally too, checking in emotionally, making sure that those negative emotions are cleared so they don't stay stuck.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful. I kind of want to reverse the scenario and tell me how and if maybe EMDR wouldn't be the tool of choice in this scenario. But I know we've worked with clients and they definitely talk about it, and body keeps the score. And I think some of this overlaps into parts work, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, but you've got someone who they know they're being triggered, right? Like that word's so overused right now, but they know that their responses go far beyond the current situation, right? Or they might be having physical sensations that they know aren't about an actual current injury, right? Their body's trying to tell them something, but maybe there's some childhood molestation they don't even consciously aware of. They don't even remember that it happened. They've blocked it. They've dissociated. Our brains, we talk a lot about that with clients, because our brains do that so we can survive. So I always reassure clients, like, that's a survival mechanism that you will never lose. So
Mhm.
sometimes when we're trying to help somebody be more fully present, be more fully in their body, I reassure them because they're scared. I
Mhm.
reassure them, like, no healing exists until you feel it. So I need you to come back in because you can't change something that you're not aware of,
Mhm.
but that you'll never lose that skill of leaving. But let's let it be a skill that you can use when
Mhm.
you want to, not that's just running your life and suddenly you're
Right.
home. But
Yes.
so if they're, can you work it more backwards, I guess? Like you're talking about them
Mhm.
choosing, like they could sit down and say, like, let's go big or go home. I want to talk about my rape when I was 16. Or I want to
Mhm.
talk about the rollover car accident that killed my best friend and injured me
Mhm.
when I was 18, whatever, right?
Mhm.
If they're aware of a scenario that they know has trauma trapped in their body. But what if there's something where they're more, it's more vague right now? They're having these funky symptoms, these funky reactions, these
Right.
things they know aren't proportionate, and working backward towards finding something. Maybe, I mean, I just use child molestation as an
Right.
example. That's like more
Right.
commonly
Yeah.
blocked.
Yeah. So I love that you talked about, because you're talking about
Mm.
parts work right
Yeah.
here again. And talking about, so before I even start processing, I do some parts work. I don't do super, super in depth, but kind of like who's driving your car? Who's showing up today? Is your anxiety driving your car? Is it that 6-year-old child who was
Yeah.
beat? Is it like who's showing up? And saying that all these parts of you are good. All these parts are important. And so you don't want to take them out of the car ride. You don't want them to stay behind in the car ride. They're all invited, but you just don't want them
Hmm.
driving, right? And maybe you don't even want them navigating next to you. And so maybe you were sitting behind you breathing down your neck. So make your car bigger. Have it a 15-passenger van, have it a bus. And so I tell people, and I call it the risk manager, the anxiety that comes up, or that little child that's like trying to protect, that's coming up, and say your risk manager is always going to be there. If for some reason you're unsafe, she's going to jump up and she'll be there for you. So you don't have to worry about her going away. But who do you want driving the car of your life? Like, who is in control? Like, Amy, do you want to drive your car, or do you want your anxiety driving your car? And so really kind of making daily choices in your mind about who's driving, who's showing up, starting to recognize what parts of me are showing up. Is it that wounded 13-year-old, or is it that pissed off 18-year-old? Is it, who is showing up, and being able to start recognizing what parts of me are there. Maybe it's grief. Maybe grief is really present, and grief has been driving for a really long time. Not that and you want grief to stay there. That's a part of you. There's things in grief that you can process through, but you'll always have a part of that. And so it's just figuring out like who's driving the car, right? And maybe there's some parts, and I kind of also talk about it as like a Zoom meeting. And so maybe a Zoom meeting with yourself and all your parts. And so maybe there's some parts, like in a meeting, we've all been there, that there's some people that talk and talk and talk, and you're just like, could they like be quiet, please? Like other people would like to participate. So you might have some parts of yourself that are just talking and dominating, where you have other parts of yourself in that corner that are blacked out. They don't have their face up, their name might not be up, and they're muted. So it's like, you know what? Come off a mute, show your face, participate, because there's some parts of you who haven't been participating in your life or showing up in your life. They're there, they're in the background, but they haven't been present. So inviting those parts to start to be present and start giving them a voice as well. Because maybe anxiety, I'm just using anxiety as an
Right.
example. Anxiety has been so loud, um, and so that no other parts have been able to come up. And so I do also a lot of inner child work,
Yeah.
and going back and mothering yourself and telling that little girl, what does she need? Because a lot of times it's that little girl that's inside of us screaming, or that teenager that's hurt. And so going back, and what would you tell yourself at that age? What did that little girl need to hear? What did she need to receive? And so incorporating the inner child work a lot with EMDR, to be able to go back. And sometimes, we don't have healthy mother figures, or maybe our mother figures didn't know how to help us, but we know now what we needed. And so we need to mother ourselves and give that to ourselves.
Yeah, I think one thing, I'm an Enneagram 7, and we won't get off on an Enneagram tangent. Don't worry, everybody. But handling grief well is not my thing. That's
Mhm.
been a lifelong journey. Sevens like to avoid anything negative and unpleasant. They're looking for the next adventure, what's fun, what's new. maybe share, and maybe this isn't like your main alley, so feel free to say so, but I know, let's use the example you brought up earlier, right? Somebody's lost a child. That
Mhm.
is probably one of the worst, most unimaginable
Yeah.
griefs that could possibly be endured.
Yeah.
It's completely understandable that the anniversary of that, or their birthday, or whatever other
Mhm.
state of significance would bring up in you emotions, that you would be off balance during that time, that triggers would come up and things would be a lot more unsettled. Yet I also believe therapy, processing, growth, there's normal healthy grieving, and then there's prolonged suffering, where it becomes perseveration, where it becomes an identity, where it becomes a box we choose to sit in. Maybe I shouldn't have used that example because I've not lived through that. Either way, how do you help people navigate honoring the emotion without being stuck there?
Mhm.
That's really the question. The actual grief for the incident doesn't matter.
Right, right. Um, Again, this is gonna look so different to each person. If we're talking about losing a child, what for honoring that birthday or that anniversary, what does that mom or what do that family feel like would be helpful for them? Do they want to do a memorial, or do they want to light a candle and, sing to the baby, or maybe they have a blanket that they want to give the baby. So something to do that's remembering them, and maybe they don't want to do anything. And so I
Right.
think just honoring what they need and what they want, but also helping them, how do you take care of yourself around these spaces? Like, what do you want for yourself? Maybe it's you doing some self-care around this time. And if we've processed, more than likely, if I know an anniversary is coming up, we're gonna do a lot of resourcing, a lot of grounding, a lot of preparation work before we get there. I'm not gonna just, you know, but I have had people come to me and say, "Hey, this huge thing's going on. I need to be okay." And so sometimes I'll try to get people to where they need to be, but I'm backtracking again, because you also said, what if EMDR is not appropriate for that person? Then I just do a ton of resourcing, and I still do somatic pieces in the resourcing. So I'll do some guided imagery. Where do you notice that in your body? Sometimes it can be with co-regulation with their children. And so how do you co-regulate with your child? I know this isn't grief, but wanting to
Yeah.
also address the question that you had said. And so I kind of just see what they need. And something I always ask clients is, what do you want for today? What do you want to get out of today? Because yes, we have this whole treatment plan that we're going to work on, but maybe today you just need to vent. And yes, this is still a part of EMDR, right? Because I'm still gathering information, we're still resourcing, we're still doing coping skills, even though we may not be processing. And then sometimes people will say, I want to process today. I've even had people that feel like, let's do twice a week, or let's do a 2-hour block because we just need to get through so much, or it's a significant memory that we're processing. Like if it is the death of a child, and we've said we've worked around and done different things, and so we're hitting the big one today. So let's, block out extra time for that. So we've done that as well. Um, and so I think just really seeing, what does that mom want, or what does that person want, and what do they need to feel some relief.
Yeah, that's
Um, and
beautiful.
and it's going to look different for everybody. Sometimes I have people that just need to cry, that need to vent, that, I have a huge box of tissues right next to in my office. And so sometimes it's even doing some sensory things.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely know some therapists that like incorporate sensory things or movement things on purpose to just keep
Mhm,
things moving through the body so the different layers can process.
mhm, mhm.
I sometimes
And
joke, like that's one of my beefs that I want to ask God about, is like,
mhm,
why couldn't we process something on an emotional level, a mental level, and a physical level at the same
mhm.
time? You know,
Mhm.
I could have mentally addressed something. I think I'm over it. I think I'm using air quotes, guys, if you're not watching the video. But like, I think I've processed it, I've forgiven, I've whatever. And yet, years later, maybe something physical in my body jumps right to that incident. And it's like, whoa.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I would like it in a much neater, less messy package, but that's not the way trauma works at all.
It's not,
Anything else
yeah.
you want to say about the processing versus getting stuck before we move on from that?
So sometimes if people are stuck, I might do bilateral stimulation differently or really focusing on grounding because maybe if they're stuck, there's something that's going on. It's either a part that's not wanting to move forward, they're feeling disconnected. So sometimes I'll even be like, okay, sit on my rug. Let's sit on the rug together and really ground. And my rug is fuzzy, so like feel the rug. And so just kind of being able to really get in touch with sensory and like if you're sitting or laying on the ground, you're really feeling your body. So what else are you noticing in your body? So sometimes just shifting around can help. Um, and like even identifying, okay, so there's a part of you that is resistant. Can you figure out what that part is? Do you know who that is that's showing up? And so really helping them to to see like there's other parts of you that want to move forward, but this part for some reason is stuck and doesn't feel safe and doesn't want to move forward. Um, I've I became trained in EMDR in 2012. Um, and so I would say like there's probably only two people that I have said that I've started maybe doing resourcing with EMDR that I wasn't able to move past the resourcing stage. And there were specific reasons for that, just with their own mental health.
Yeah.
And again, like most people, even if, you know, again, when we're taught with EMDR, I say make sure people are stable. And so that's part of what we do is we do preparation work, we do resourcing, we do history taking,
Right.
making sure people are in a good space to process because sometimes things come up. And so I'll say if something comes up over the week, shoot me a text. I can just help you kind of like process it out a little bit, just or we can schedule a sooner appointment and just really hone in on out and work on that. So things are going to come up because you're having shifts in your body. So things may come up. I've had people actually before, and it's been on telehealth. So um, before we started the processing, they had to excuse themselves to a room and throw up
Yeah.
because it was coming out,
Yeah.
people just, crying, people that, need to use the restroom in between, just things, there's shifts and there's movement in your body. And so that
Absolutely.
happens. And so I'll always plan with people. I always ask if they have a history of epilepsy as well,
Yeah.
just to make sure that that's not triggering them. And so we'll do a few kind of practice things. I don't use light bars. So, and I don't do eye movement with people with epilepsy. I do more tapping and potentially buzzies if we're finding that that's safe, but I'll make a safety plan too, especially if I have clients that are like, hey, I tend to faint when I get really upset. Okay, well, what do you want me to do if you faint? Or do you know when you're going to faint? So I safety plan those things a little bit as well, because again, if fainting is a normal thing for them, I don't want to cause trouble by calling the ambulance if they're going to like
Right.
wake up in 2 minutes, right? But I've never had anyone do that, but I do walk through that. So that way I am prepared to know how to address that with them. Or, if somebody does have a seizure, probably I would just make sure that they would stop and, get them in a safe space. But again, that hasn't happened, but just safety
Well, I'm
planning
sure the
as
fact
well.
that, yeah, I'm sure the fact that you ask those questions and take that into account, though, helps them to feel safe, that you're thinking
Mm-hmm.
through all of that also. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, that's huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm
Hmm.
sorry. I went on a little tangent.
No, that was great. Yeah, I mean, there's so much, right? And like you said, every person's story is literally different. Every blade of
Mhm.
grass they've walked on to get where they are is 100%
Mhm.
different person to person to person. Even people growing up in the same household,
Right.
even twins, like all of it, they're
Mhm.
very, very different lenses and experiences.
Mhm.
And so therefore, of course, there's tons of different therapies and ways to get into the body and ways to access the subconscious and ways to help integrate. And you've definitely opened my eyes to some other pieces that weren't necessarily on my radar, and some language to put on things, which I think can be really helpful for educating and communicating with people about what's possible and about what they might be experiencing, and just help, like you said, make them feel safe, giving them a space to shift. It's definitely what we focus on. Like, let's just make room for things to be different. We get on autopilot. Our brains like to be on autopilot,
Yes.
and we're just cruising. It's like you can't recognize change and shift on autopilot. So that's my teacher, John Barnes' cliche of, feeling is healing. Without awareness,
Yeah.
there is no change, because you won't notice it even if it does change.
Right.
So you've already shared that you focus a lot on women and surrounding the pregnancy and postpartum period. Anything else you'd like to share about the work that you do, or ideal clients, resources?
Yeah. So my main focus is perinatal. I do see people for EMDR that are not perinatal as well. And some people will start to do EMDR and they're like, I'm not really sure if I like this, or I want to, I'd rather just kind of talk through things. And so I think I meet people where they are. And so resources would be, when I talk about resources, I like to talk about coping skills. Not necessarily like I can give you some names of books and things.
Well, I'm thinking even people that are listening that might
Mhm,
want to find a practitioner in their area that don't
mhm.
live in Phoenix.
Yes. So if you would go on to, if you're certified, or if you're pregnant postpartum, postpartum Support International, there's a website. So in Arizona, it's psiarizona.org. And there's a section where you can find providers who are certified, who are trained and certified in perinatal mental health, who you can look by region, insurance, language, availability. So for perinatal mental health, that's what I would recommend. If you're looking for EMDR, EMDRIA.org, and there's find a provider. So you can, again, find them in any state, any city. There's telehealth, there's in person. And so you just search. So those are two resources. And then there's also, if you're not finding, well, I'm sure you'll find what you're looking for between those two. But then there's also Psychology Today. But Psychology Today tends to be more general rather than like specific perinatal. And so here's something I like to say is, if you are pregnant or trying to conceive, experiencing infertility, or postpartum, really search for somebody who is certified in perinatal mental health. It's kind of like going to a doctor. Like, you go to the PCP and you're going there with an issue with your eye. And they're like, oh yeah, I can see there's a problem with your eye. Here's an eye drop. And then you're like, okay, this is like, all right, I feel okay, but I'm not feeling great. Instead of going to an optometrist or an ophthalmologist who can actually do the testing and the diagnostics and really work through what is really happening with your eye, what's really going on. So I like to kind of make that comparison with perinatal mental health and a therapist who may be just generalized, or even just an EMDR therapist that's not certified in perinatal mental health. Having that certification is really important to really understand those ins and outs, especially as we're talking about, what postpartum anxiety and postpartum OCD, how that shows up, because the way we would treat postpartum OCD is very different than how we would treat regular OCD, and it shows up differently. And so just somebody who's certified in perinatal would know that, whereas somebody who's not wouldn't know those differences, or might, be alarmed at what the mom is experiencing. Where someone with perinatal mental health that's, we're comfortable, and it doesn't shock us, if that makes sense. And then
No, that's an
it's
important distinction, and I appreciate that. We do a lot of educating on what a quality provider is and what matters for certain situations. So no, that's a huge distinction. And like, I think I'm hearing you say, finding someone who's certified in that perinatal or perinatal mental health is more important than whether or not they're parts theory or EMDR or brain
Mhm.
mapping or somato experiencing, like having that foundation of truly knowing moms and women and hormones and transitions and the different aspects of that spectrum we were talking about. Yeah, that makes sense. That would definitely be the most critical piece. And guys, again, don't worry, I'm writing all these resources down. We're going to have those in the show notes. Well, and lastly too, Diane, where can they find you? Because you do telehealth, so it doesn't have to be here in Phoenix. Where can they connect with you? Websites, any other places that you're found?
Yeah, so I have a website. I'll spell it out for you. Palacioscrewcounseling.com. So PALACIOSCREW counseling.com. I also have a Facebook page, Palacios Crew Counseling LLC. I have Instagram as well. So Palacios Crew Counseling. So you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. On my webpage, if you go to my webpage, there's a place where you can submit for inquiries. And so you can connect with me that way. And then I email back. I always get back to people within a few hours. I think that that's important just because when people are searching for help, they're usually feeling pretty desperate. People don't come to me because they are having a good day. And so I know that, and I want to be quick to respond. So if you do reach out to me, and even if it's I'm not the right provider for you, I can help connect you with somebody else as well.
Brilliant. I love it. Thank you so much. Last thing I think I want to ask is just, you sort of just mentioned it, even if you're not the right provider or even if they're not in crisis, I mean, you're probably like me, like I obviously think anybody in pregnancy or postpartum should for sure see a pelvic health therapist because like you were sharing, we're the ones trained in all of that anatomy and all of the range of
Right.
normal and dysfunction of all of that anatomy and the pump function, the sexual function, all of those pieces, digestive, everything. Similarly, even though most people don't call you till they're in crisis,
Mhm.
what are a couple tips or things that you would share, like you said, when women are just starting to think about conceiving? Especially if they have a known history or they know they have some childhood trauma. Oh, and we need to circle back to EMDR being safe during pregnancy.
Yes.
So sorry, I
Exactly.
jumped a bunch right there. So what
Oh,
would you say to women who are just thinking about getting pregnant and whether or not they should look into any of this kind of work? And then let's go to EMDR and pregnancy.
yeah, yeah. Well, something that's really interesting is even when we were doing the birth expo a few weeks ago,
Yeah.
a lot of people say, oh, cool, there's massage therapy, there's birth photography, there's doula, there's birth, there's birth centers, and they're like, therapy? Like, and so sometimes people don't want to come to the booth, and I understand it because nobody wants to need therapy, but just
Same for
normalizing it.
my side of it too. Nobody
Right? Like
wants
nobody,
my hand
right?
in their vagina or rectum for that matter.
Right. And
Yeah.
nobody wants incontinence or whatever other issues happen, right? Like
Yeah.
nobody wants that, but it happens. And so I think just being able to normalize and destigmatize, and there's not shame in getting help. And actually, you're setting yourself up for having support. Because if you know, okay, I tend to be an anxious person already, or maybe I've had past trauma, or then that way you have support with you through pregnancy, through postpartum, and even if there's fertility challenges. So you don't feel so alone with it. And so I think that that's important. Someone just to kind of track you and check in on you. And so I use Edinburgh, which
Yeah.
is it's 10 questions, but it just kind of assesses and I send it to people, but I also talk through it or just really checking in and saying like, okay, so how are you? Okay, so how are you really? And just having someone who you can be 100% honest with. I've had clients who, even the first session, they're like, I'm really uncomfortable. I don't want to be here. Like I could have sworn that like this one client was going to leave like after 5 minutes. And then I just kind of like, I think as therapists, we're kind of like empaths and we can just feel that energy. And so I just kind of like sat back and I just like was like, I'm just gonna just feel what she needs. And she told me a few months ago, she's like, you're the person I tell everything to. And she's been with me for over a year. And so just being able to understand, I think, but that it is scary to see a therapist. It is scary to feel like, hey, I need additional support, but that's what we're there for.
Yeah.
We're there to be able to, to provide that extra support and be an extra set of eyes, like to say like, hey, it looks like you're really struggling. And I've even had those conversations with moms is like, we're doing EMDR, we're working, but it looks like maybe you could potentially use some medication to help you.
Yeah.
And just having that safe environment and just non-judgmental to be able to just like, I see you. And I think sometimes it's hard to be seen in this
Well,
world.
and to keep the parallel going, like same thing with me, it's the outcomes, right? It's like nobody wants to dive into our grief and sadness and trauma and our mess, but it's the outcomes, right? It's being able to live without those triggers. It's ability to be integrated, like you said, to prepare and feel like you have the support you need to minimize the chances of a significant postpartum flare up, if they're seeing you and dealing with some stuff ahead of time. Same with us. They don't necessarily, it's not necessarily a spa day to come in here, although some of the myofascial work's really pleasant, but they don't want to pee when they work out, and they don't want to have painful sex, and they want to have great orgasms, and they want to know their body's healthy and strong. So yeah, it's the outcomes, it's the peace, it's the support and the knowing themselves that I think is what makes it really worth it. All right. So EMDR during pregnancy,
Yes.
let's break it down.
Okay.
Safe or not
Yeah.
safe?
Safe, absolutely safe. And the reason why it's safe is because you have all this, you or someone may have this trauma living in your body, or this fear, this anxiety, or whatever it may be. And so wanting to release it before birth, releasing it before the baby comes, because then that way you're actually clearing some pathways for the baby to be born. And maybe you're unblocking, maybe there's some mental blocks, emotional blocks, physical blocks that are keeping you from having maybe the birth experience you want, or even just bonding with the baby when the baby's there. And so with pregnancy, sometimes I'll find that EMDR with pregnant women, sometimes it's more of like, we'll process, and then we'll have a session where we talk more, we process, or we talk. And it's just very much of what do they need? What are they feeling? And I've even had a mom come in and say, like, I feel a lot of tightness and in my belly. And so we processed, and she's like, that tightness is released. And it was just, it was just amazing to realize like, oh, I was holding some space in my belly that was really tight. And then I was noticing, and that after I processed through what I needed to process, that was released, that tightness, that discomfort was released.
Well, I think some people that say it's not safe, is there a reason because, oh, you're going to release trauma and the baby's going to have to experience that while mom's processing it? Is that their argument?
I believe that's kind of the old school argument about it, as you don't want to disturb the baby or anything. If the mom's disturbed, the baby's going to be disturbed. But the thing about EMDR and healing is that, we don't leave people disturbed, like,
well, and your body's only going to process.
Disturbed.
Yeah. Like what we tell clients, your body's only going to process what your subconscious feels safe to let go of anyway. Like I can't force somebody to unwind. I can't force them to thaw from a freeze response. I can't make them go into some past something, and EMDR doesn't either. So unless they're already feeling safe enough to let that go, and it's in there anyway, it's in their body, that trauma's in there impacting mom and baby anyway.
And sometimes people, even when they're processing, it's not the memories that they're remembering or things that are coming up, but it's somatic, it's feelings. It's, oh, I'm feeling tightness, or I'm feeling tension in my chest, or now it's moved to my stomach. And so some people process very somatically, and then it's like, it's gone. I feel peace now. And they haven't even had like a specific memory. So I kind of like to explain it. It's like, if you're sitting on a train and you're looking out the window, and when you're processing with EMDR, you've got these memories. It's like looking out the train, you see different scenery, and then you'll say, stop. And like, what do you notice? And you tell me, okay, what you're noticing right then and there. And so some people, it's just feelings that they're processing rather than different memories that come up. And so some people, the other question is does it uncover memories that you have forgotten or that you don't remember? Well, it can, but that's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to get to unstick, to become unstuck, to release the things that need to be released. And so if something doesn't need to be released, I'm not digging for things.
Yeah.
Your brain is just doing what it needs to heal. And so I tell people your brain is just allow your brain to do what it needs to do. Your brain's going to heal itself. And that's the beautiful thing about EMDR. I stay out of the way. It's that person's brains that's healing.
Yeah. Same. Love, love, love it. We have covered a lot. These are going to be a lot of show notes, guys, but we will pack it in for you. Diane, thank you so much. Is there any last tidbits you feel like we didn't get to or that you want to make sure and cover?
So there is an amazing, amazing resource that deals with perinatal mental health and EMDR. And so it's the Touchstone Institute. And so I'm going to name drop here, but Mara Tesler-Stein, Dr. Mara Tesler-Stein. She is the founder, and she trains and certifies clinicians in EMDR that are certified in perinatal mental health. So she has a ton of trainings about NICU, and this is more for providers, right? But NICU and bereavement and trauma. And so she's an amazing resource as well. And so if somebody's looking for a provider and they're not in Arizona, you can always look on her website, and there's a list of providers that are perinatal mental health EMDR providers.
Awesome.
And so
Thank you.
I can tell you, I can look that up on my phone super quick. The exact website. Let's see. So it is touchstoneinstitute.org.
Got it.
Yeah.
Awesome. I appreciate it so much. And we'll definitely include the resources for people to connect with you. And I mean, I think everybody should be in therapy of some sort.
Yeah.
We need perspective. We need support. We need that guidance to see the things we can't see. I mean, it's why I'm in a business mastermind. It's, there's so many aspects, right? Like the whole know better, do better. Well, you need some other way to know better because you're just on the path you're on. And we all have our blinders, and we all have things like you said. I love the big T, little t also. Like that's definitely one of my takeaways from our chat is that, I think people are like, why, no one ever beat me. All those things, right? The stories we tell ourselves about like, well, my problems aren't that bad or whatever, but we all have these layers of different things that have occurred in life. And you'd probably love the book. It's written by a colleague of mine, What's in Your Web? His name's Phil Tavalacci. And he does such a great job of painting that picture of how there can be like emotional traumas, physical traumas, mental traumas, and different things. And the body keeps the score.
Yes, it does.
And
yes,
it's
it
just in there waiting to. I also love that you shared about fawn because I mean, I still find that most people have only heard of fight or flight. I find that freeze is even somewhat new information to them, but fawn, I've never heard anybody except mental health providers talk about it. Like it's on my radar, but barely. Like I've only heard that from other mental health workers and therapists of some sort.
Yeah.
And I think do you ever see fawn showing up? I could ask you questions all day. Do you ever see fawn showing up when it isn't a piece of parts? Like there's a disconnect, right? That there's this like childlike response, that trauma response, that codependent enabler.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to use those words, codependency enabler. Sometimes if there's families with addiction, that's something I also don't think I touched on, but like with perinatal mental health as well as if there's co-occurring disorders, substance use and or medical, that also compounds what's happening. But in families where there's also addiction or just unhealthy families in general, that fawn response can be very strong, is that I need to fix it. I need to make it better. I need to just kind of like put the Band-Aid on it.
Do you work
And
much with addiction, or is that something you usually, if that's the main issue, is that something you typically refer out to?
so before I opened my private practice, I worked with a lot of teens in addiction. And so I am certified in ACRA, which is Adolescent Community Reinforcement Approach. It's an outpatient approach. And so if somebody's needing outpatient, I can do that, and I do. But if somebody is, their main issue is I mean, it's all trauma, right? It's substance use trauma. So
They're
I think
numbing
I
something.
right, right. And so I kind of see what is depending the level of care they need. If they need a higher level of care, I will refer them to an IOP program or potentially inpatient or partial hospitalization. If they are able to do outpatient and do like once a week or twice a week, I can see them. And so it just depends what their treatment goals are, what they're wanting. And so I have to assess that. And so I do a complimentary phone consult for everybody that I see in my practice. And so then that way I can really see, am I the right match for you?
Like I said, I could talk to you all day, but thank you so much for taking the time to share all of this with us. We're going to pause it here, guys. Probably have to have you back on. I think I say that a lot, but it's just such an important topic. And I recently had Chrissy Shaver on, and she's with Positively Fit and also the Live Well Training Center. She uses a lot of movement-based trauma therapy, but it's just such an important topic that people need more resources for. It's also why I had Chad on talking about the TRE sessions we offer here. Yeah, it's definitely on my heart and something that we've been trying to promote a lot and help people have a lot more awareness of and resources for. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an honor.
All right, you guys, that is another episode of Bellies, Babies, and Birth. Please share this out. Obviously, today's episode does not just have to do with pregnant or women, definitely geared towards that, but even family members that might need this support or just awareness for trauma, other birth workers and providers. We need general medical providers to have a lot more awareness about this too. So like it, subscribe, all the things, share it out. Appreciate you guys so much, and we'll see you on the next episode.